All right, guys, here's a quick take on potential GDP, which is one of the more important elements as we're studying GDP. So potential GDP is the value of real GDP when all the economy's factors of production, labor, capital, land, and entrepreneur ability are fully employed. So the easiest way to think about this is at full employment. Okay, that's full employment of all resources, but because we are doing AP and micro, it's always going to be kind of about the labor. But when we're at full employment and all our resources are used correctly, and again, remember that full employment doesn't mean everybody has a job. It means we're using all of our resources correctly, which means there will be some unemployment because of that. Then we have what we call potential GDP. And so in this little graph I've made up, and this is not a real graph, it's just something I put together, we have potential GDP in the purple line. Okay, that's essentially when we are at full employment. And again, what that would be called is real GDP at full employment is potential GDP. Now what happens, and we'll get more into detail this as the semester goes along, what happens is that real GDP fluctuates around the potential. So sometimes real GDP is less than potential GDP, and other times real GDP is more than the potential. When the real GDP is higher than the potential, we have an inflationary gap. When the real GDP is lower than the PGDP, we're going to have a recessionary gap. Now the big ta-da is for the rest of the semester, what we're going to be doing is looking at how real GDP is rotating around the potential GDP. And when we have an inflationary gap, we're going to learn what does the Federal Reserve and what does Congress and the president do to try to cure an inflationary gap. And when real GDP is less than potential GDP, what we're going to learn is how the Federal Reserve and how the government employs fiscal policy to eliminate a recessionary gap. So that's kind of the big ta-da that's going to happen. So again, potential GDP, and it's far more complicated than I'm explaining it, but potential GDP is when we're using all our resources and they're at full employment. That means that we're going to have real GDP at full employment is the potential GDP, and then when real GDP is above it, it's going to be an inflationary gap, and when real GDP is below it, it's going to be a recessionary gap. Okay, thanks for checking us out.